My name is Tiana. At 27 years old, I was leading a life that seemed simple and peaceful, teaching elementary school. On the surface, everything appeared calm, but beneath it all, I carried a past far more complicated than anyone could imagine, carefully hidden from the world. It all began the day I met Matthew at a small cafe near the school where I taught. He was unlike anyone I had ever known. Matthew was genuine, kind-hearted, and had a smile that could light up even the darkest room. From the moment our eyes met, there was an undeniable connection. Little did I know Matthew was hiding a secret. He was the heir to one of the wealthiest and most powerful families in the country, the Millers. As our relationship grew, so did our bond. It felt natural, like we had known each other forever. What stood out the most was how Matthew never once mentioned his family's wealth. I, too, kept my past hidden. To him, I was simply Tiana, the modest teacher who loved her students and lived in a cozy apartment. After 6 months together, the school planned a trip to the aquarium. Matthew, ever the thoughtful soul, volunteered to accompany us and help supervise the children. It was a perfect spring day, and the excitement in the air was palpable as we guided the kids from one exhibit to the next. We stopped by the penguin enclosure, where the little creatures waddled together in harmony. Matthew leaned down to one of the kids, whispered something in their ear, then stood up straight and turned to me. "I've been doing my homework," he said with a playful grin. "Did you know that penguins mate for life? They stay together forever. I want to do the same, Tiana. I love you." Before I could fully process his words, Matthew dropped to one knee right there in front of the penguins, with the children's giggles filling the air. He pulled out a small velvet box, opened it, and revealed a sparkling ring. "Tiana, will you marry me?" he asked, his voice filled with emotion. I stood there for a moment, overwhelmed by the suddenness of it all. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed the children. They were holding up homemade signs that read, "Say yes, Miss Vaughn, and marry Matthew." I couldn't help but laugh through my tears, and without hesitation, I nodded. "Yes, Matthew, I'll marry you," I said, my heart swelling with joy. The children cheered, and the sound of their laughter echoed all around us. It was a moment I would never forget. But, as with all good things, joy often comes hand in hand with complications. Matthew told me his father wanted to meet me. His tone was cautious, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something important was about to happen. "My father wants to meet you," he said one evening, his voice quiet but tense. Meeting Richard Miller felt like stepping into the lion's den. His office was on the top floor of a towering skyscraper, offering a sweeping view of the city below. But it wasn't the view that unsettled me. It was the way he looked at me. His eyes seemed to cut through me, as if he were judging my very soul. I could feel his assessment before he even spoke. "So, you're a teacher?" he asked, his tone almost condescending. I hesitated for a moment, caught off guard, but I kept my composure. "Yes, sir," I said quietly, unsure of what else to say. "Do you know how much Miller Enterprises is worth?" he pressed, his voice dripping with superiority. "No, sir. I'm not interested in those things," I answered honestly, trying to steady my racing heart. His wealth meant nothing to me. He let out a dry laugh, void of warmth. "Everyone says that at first. Then, when the divorce comes, they all want half of everything," he added bitterly, launching into a long-winded speech about protecting family wealth, how no one should ever be able to take it from them. Finally, he pulled a document from his desk drawer and slid it across the table. "It's simple, Miss Tiana. If you want to marry my son, you'll sign this," he said. "It's a prenuptial agreement, waiving any claim to the Miller fortune. No money, no property, nothing." Matthew, who had been silent up until that point, finally spoke up, his frustration evident in his voice. "Dad, this is ridiculous," he said sharply. "Tiana is not like that." "Tiana," Richard shot back. "They're all the same until they prove otherwise." "Enough, Dad," Matthew shouted. "Don't talk about my future wife like that ever again." "Tiana, you don't need to sign it," Matthew said. I sat there, the weight of the moment thick in the air. Richard's cold, unwavering gaze was fixed on me. Without a second thought, I picked up the pen and signed the document. My swift action seemed to take Richard by surprise. "You're not even going to read it?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "I don't need to, Mr. Miller," I replied calmly, meeting his gaze. "I'm not interested in your money. I love Matthew." The following months were a whirlwind of wedding planning. The Miller family insisted on a lavish ceremony, more about showcasing their wealth than celebrating love. My mother, Nia, observed the whole process with a mixture of amusement and concern. She was the only one who knew the truth about my past, the only one who understood why I could sign that contract without a second thought. The night before the wedding, my mother called me into her room. Her expression was serious, almost secretive. She handed me a sealed envelope, her hands trembling slightly. "Your biological father left this for you," she said softly. "He wanted you to open it on your wedding day." My heart skipped a beat. "My biological father?" I asked, my voice unsteady. I had never known my real father. My mother had always told me she raised me alone. At least, that's what I had believed all these years. "There's so much you don't know, Tiana," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "So much I've kept hidden to protect you. Tomorrow, when you open this, you'll understand everything." The morning of the wedding arrived, and the cathedral was filled with the country's most powerful business figures, friends, and associates of the Millers. My mother sat in the front row, holding the mysterious envelope. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes spoke volumes. Just before the ceremony began, Richard Miller approached me with a smirk on his face. "I hope you don't regret signing that contract, dear daughter-in-law," he said sweetly, though there was an underlying malice in his tone. It was then that my mother, standing quietly at the back of the church, decided it was time. With a calm but purposeful voice, she rose from her seat and walked toward me, holding the envelope. "It's time, darling," she said, her words carrying a weight that hung heavily in the air. My heart raced as I took the envelope from her. My hands trembled as I tore it open, everyone's eyes on me. Inside, I found a letter and several legal documents that I didn't fully understand. As I began to read the letter aloud, the room seemed to shift. Richard Miller, who had been standing beside me, his face full of smug arrogance, suddenly went pale. His face twisted as disbelief and fear spread across his features. The letter began. "Dear Tiana, if you're reading this, it means your wedding day has come, and unfortunately, I am not there to walk you down the aisle. My name is Albert Vaugh, and I am your father." The world around me seemed to blur as I tried to process this shock. But the letter wasn't finished. "Before you continue reading, please review the attached documents," it instructed. I pulled out the papers from the envelope, my hand shaking. The first documents were property deeds, followed by stock certificates and financial records. As I flipped through each one, I noticed Richard Miller's face growing even paler. His lips moved, barely audible, as he muttered under his breath. "Impossible," he whispered. "Vaugh Industries." I read on, my voice steady despite the emotions threatening to break through. "You may be wondering why you never knew me. The answer is long and painful. Your mother and I were deeply in love, but our business enemies were relentless. After several attempts on my life, I made the hardest decision to disappear to protect both you and your mother, Nia. Your mother agreed to keep everything a secret and create a new life for you, far away from the corporate world that caused us so much pain. But I never stopped watching over you from the shadows. Vaugh Industries did not disappear as everyone believes. It simply transformed, operating under different names and across various countries. All these years, I've been building an empire for you, my only heir. The documents you hold give you full control of Vaugh Holdings, a conglomerate that includes 40% of global tech industries, the Blue Moon Hotel chain, Vaugh Pharmaceuticals, and a majority stake in Miller Enterprises. By now, Richard was visibly shaken, leaning against one of the church's grand columns. His face drained of color, his disbelief palpable. "A majority stake isn't possible," he muttered, trying to regain his composure as he glanced from the documents to me, then back to the papers. I continued reading, my voice unwavering. "Yes, my daughter. For years, I've secretly acquired shares in Miller Enterprises through various shell companies. As of today, you control 51% of the Miller business empire. Why reveal this now? Because my sources informed me of the unjust prenuptial contract you were forced to sign. Richard Miller, known for his ruthless business tactics, now found himself on the defensive. The truth was coming to light, and I felt the weight of it settling deep in my bones. Your mother has secretly managed this entire empire under different identities, preparing for this moment. She will teach you everything you need to know. I love you, my daughter. I hope you can forgive my absence and understand that every decision I made was to protect you. With eternal love, your father, Albert Vaugh." The silence that followed in the cathedral was deafening. I looked up to see Matthew staring at me, his eyes filled with a mix of astonishment and admiration. Richard stood frozen as though he had seen a ghost. His arrogance had evaporated, replaced by fear. My mother, now standing tall and confident, looked every bit the powerful businesswoman she truly was. Gone was the quiet accountant. In her place stood the strategist who had played the long game all along. "Mr. Miller," my mother said, her voice thick with authority, "I think it's time we renegotiate that prenuptial agreement. Don't you?" Richard, clearly rattled, tried to recover his composure. "This is a trick. Va is dead. His company was dissolved years ago." My mother remained unflinching. She reached into her handbag and pulled out a stack of documents. "Are you sure?" she replied smoothly. "I have here the records of every stock transaction involving Miller Enterprises for the past 20 years. Would you like to review them?" Matthew stepped forward, taking my hand in his. He squeezed it reassuringly before speaking. "I don't care if you're richer than my entire family, Tiana. I love you for who you are," he said, his words filling me with warmth. Tears sprang to my eyes, and I whispered back, "And I love you, Matthew. I never cared about money, yours or mine." At that moment, Richard lost all semblance of control. "This is an ambush, a conspiracy," he roared. But his outburst was interrupted by a voice from the back of the church. An older man, leaning heavily on a cane, began making his way toward us. As he slowly approached, whispers spread through the cathedral. The older businessman in the room recognized him immediately. "It's poetic justice," the man said, his voice carrying unmistakable authority. "Albert Vaughn." Several people murmured in awe. Richard's face went completely white, his expression a mix of terror and disbelief. I felt a rush of emotions as I looked at the man standing before me, the father I had never known, the one who had stayed hidden all these years. He stopped in front of me, his eyes, identical to mine, filled with tears. "I'm sorry I missed so many years of your life, my daughter," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But now, I can finally be here for you on the most important day of your life." Overcome with emotion, I ran into his arms, sobbing uncontrollably. 27 years of unanswered questions, of emptiness that had haunted my heart, finally found their closure. Richard, who had been trying to sneak away, froze as my father's voice called out. "Leaving so soon, Richard? Don't you want to discuss how you tried to destroy my company 20 years ago? Or how you sent assassins to my home?" With a groan, Richard collapsed onto a nearby bench, the weight of his own guilt dragging him down. "It was business, just business," he muttered weakly. "No," my father interrupted calmly, his voice firm. "It was cruelty. The same cruelty you showed when you forced a young teacher to sign a contract that stripped her of everything. But life, as it often does, has a way of making things right." A sense of relief washed over me as my father's words resonated through the room. My mother, who had been standing quietly beside me, stepped forward and took my father's hand. In that single moment, the 20 years of separation between them seemed to vanish. Their eyes met, and I could see the love that had never truly faded. "The wedding will continue," I said, looking at Matthew, who stood by my side. "If you still want to marry the heir to Vaugh Industries." Matthew smiled, his expression warm and full of sincerity. He squeezed my hand gently. "I would marry you even if you had no money," he said, his voice steady with love. With that, the ceremony resumed, but not without significant changes. Instead of Richard Miller giving me away, it was my father who took that honor. As we walked down the aisle, I could feel Richard's eyes burning into the back of my head. But it was clear he was no longer in control. He sat quietly in his seat, defeated and exposed, as his manipulation unraveled before everyone at the reception, surrounded by family and close friends. My father shared the full story, how Richard Miller had launched a campaign to destroy Vaugh Industries using illegal and violent tactics. He explained how years ago he had faked his own death to protect us from the dangers threatening our family, working in secret to rebuild his empire piece by piece. "Your mother," my father said, glancing at her with admiration, "was extraordinary. She managed the entire empire under different identities while appearing to be a humble accountant. Without her, none of this would have been possible." The months that followed brought big changes for both our family and the business. Richard Miller was forced to step down as CEO of Miller Enterprises after his past crimes were exposed, his ruthless business tactics, and the lengths he went to in order to protect his empire. Matthew, who had always been more ethical and compassionate than his father, took over the company, steering it in a new direction with fresh ideas. After 20 years of forced separation, my parents finally married. Their wedding was small, intimate, and private, completely opposite to mine, but perfect in its simplicity. Their love story had always been about quality, not quantity. In a groundbreaking move, VAV Industries and Miller Enterprises merged under a new name, Von Miller Global. Matthew and I worked side by side to transform both companies, focusing on social responsibility and ethical business practices. We weren't just building a legacy for ourselves, we were laying the foundation for the next generation. Years later, Richard Miller, once the face of corporate greed and manipulation, came to us a changed man. Humbled by his past and filled with remorse, he sought redemption. One evening, during a family dinner, he confessed his wrongs. "Money and power consumed me," he said quietly, looking around the table with regret. "They turned me into a monster who almost destroyed my own son's life." It was a moment of raw honesty from the man who had once been a symbol of ruthless ambition. But it also reminded me that even the most lost souls can find their way back to the light. In the years that followed, we established the Nia Vaughn Foundation to support teachers and schools in underserved areas. We named it after my mother, who had shown that true strength doesn't lie in wealth or power, but in love and perseverance. She was the silent force behind our family's success, keeping everything together. My father, however, was the one who made up for lost time. He became the most devoted grandfather to our children, teaching them about business, yes, but more importantly, about integrity and compassion. It was a role he had longed for, and he embraced it with all his heart. 5 years after that life-changing wedding, our family was complete and healed. The business empire that once seemed so vital now took a back seat to the love that bound us together. We still thrived professionally, but the most important thing in our lives was our connection to one another. Every time I look at the framed prenuptial contract hanging in my office, I smile. It's a reminder of how the universe sometimes has mysterious ways of delivering justice. And when Richard Miller comes over for Sunday dinners, carrying gifts for his grandchildren and seeking business advice from my father, I'm reminded that forgiveness and redemption are possible, even for those who once seemed beyond hope. My mother often says, "Money can buy many things, but love, integrity, and family are priceless." And she's absolutely right. Our story isn't just about poetic justice or satisfying revenge. It's about the triumph of love over greed, integrity over manipulation, and family over fortune. Though I now run one of the largest business conglomerates in the country, I've never stopped teaching. Once a week, I return to the same local elementary school where I once taught. There, I've developed a project to introduce kids to the basics of teamwork and entrepreneurship. Through fun hands-on activities, they learn how to work together, come up with creative ideas, and understand simple concepts like saving money or running a small business. Some things, like the love for teaching, are part of who you are, no matter how much your life changes. This project has become my way of staying grounded, reminding myself that no matter how high you climb in life, the most important lessons are often the simplest ones. It's not just about business. It's about shaping the future, one lesson at a time. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the story, like the video and subscribe to our channel. This is Revenge Scales, where justice always finds its way. See you next time.